think you're right, it's going to be a mixed section.
Please be seated. So good evening, everyone. My name is Ingrid Willard. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you, both those of you in person and those of you online, to this celebratory event for Professor Anita Bosch's inaugural lecture. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Professor Ram Jagannath, who's here representing the Rectorate. He's our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Learning and Teaching. I'd like to acknowledge Anita's mother, Anne Bosch, her husband, Hubert, her daughter, Kira, her son, Jan, Anita's uncle, Brigadier General Bosch, Anita's aunt, Elsie Mayer, Anita's sisters and their families and other family and friends, many of whom are online, some of them in South Africa, many overseas. So wonderful that with these new hybrid events, we're able to include so many more members of our families and friends and peers. I'd also like to acknowledge members of the advisory board. Desmond Smith is here with us in the room, and other members are attending online. So an inaugural lecture is a really important milestone in any academic's career. It's an opportunity in which we ask the professor to profess, but we ask them to profess not to their academic peers, but rather to the general public. So the requirement of this lecture is that one should make one's rarefied subject area expertise much more accessible to everybody in the audience. So Anita, we know that you're going to do an amazing job of that. We've seen your ability to communicate with policymakers, with business people, with students, and with your academic peers. So we know that you're going to provide a stimulating and exciting lecture this evening. So it's my great honor to do a short introduction to Professor Anita Bosch, the third female professor in the 55-year history of the Stellenbosch Business School. Anita was born into a large Afrikaans family of all-girl siblings. She says that she's always been interested in engaging with people from different cultures, and she learned from an early age that even though she was fortunate, she was not better than anyone else. Being respectful towards others has been one of the hallmarks of her upbringing, and I must say, of the way in which she engages. She was strongly influenced by her father's entrepreneurial spirit and ability to network with world leaders and ordinary citizens alike. Her mother was a consummate professional at raising children, while also continuing to work even today as the office manager of a busy specialist practice. Anita's career has spanned both the private sector and higher education. Throughout her studies, she worked to fund her own undergraduate and postgraduate studies. Building on her exposure as a pay systems consultant and utilizing her accountancy studies, she became a bookkeeper at a powder coating plant. She then went on to serve as operations manager of a consulting firm and successfully ran a sizable for-profit operation at the University of Johannesburg. Recognizing her leadership skills, she was then tasked with establishing and growing the Human Resource Management Program at UJ, which she did. So the HRM programs were introduced alongside the more traditional industrial psychology programs which already existed at UJ. Shortly after the birth of her daughter Kira, she embarked on and completed her PhD studies at the University of Southampton in the UK. Being the youngest among the cohort of fellow PhD candidates, she found excellent confidants around the world, holding senior leaderships everywhere on all continents. They've continued to influence and advise her even today. As I mentioned earlier, she established and headed up the Human Resource Management Program at UJ, which services an amazing 4,000 students. She also managed the HR Masters and PhD research programs and prepared for and successfully concluded accreditation visits. She's also served as head of department, leading a large complement of staff. Recognizing a need to provide ordinary business people with trustworthy information, Anita initiated and is the current editor of the annual Women's Report Africa, which is now in its 12th edition. And it's lovely to see so many contributors to that report here this evening. With the support of her husband, who holds the fort with their young son when she travels to Belleville, Anita joined the Stellenbosch Business School and now holds a research chair dedicated to the study of women at work. She teaches in the leadership and organizational behavior tracks. She's also a research fellow at Frederick Business School in Belgium, a non-executive director of the National Business Initiative, and she facilitates learning for the United Nations Global Compact. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Anita Bosch.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was an activist at a very young age already. I recall writing a letter to my grade 1 teacher to ask why the other class had Friday afternoons off and we did not. My mother intercepted the letter before it could reach the teacher, shaping her daughter's boldness in an act of protection. She understood that my intent to draw attention to an unequal arrangement and probe the rationale at the source of power would perhaps be interpreted as aggression. Through her, I learned to carefully consider both sides of a particular conflict situation, which has also shaped my view and approach towards collaboration. I started learning that my actions towards people in power had to be moderated for it to be accepted and heard. After equipping myself with knowledge and then developing new knowledge, calibrating my thoughts by working with other gifted researchers, I started to understand through students how I can share this knowledge with interest groups, business leaders, and also the public at large. And now I understand I am as much a researcher and a scholar as I am an intellectual activist. Intellectual activism is not without contention. In a misguided effort to protect standards, many of my academic colleagues at different colleges and universities derogate any work that is regarded as popular as less scholarly. They see such political work as non-academic. And such norms suppress the kind of engaged scholarship that interests me and that is fundamental to intellectual activism. But because ideas and politics are everywhere, the potential for intellectual activism is also everywhere. And those are the words of Patricia Hill Collins. I invite you to take a journey with me today, not towards closure and resolution, and my students hear this often, not towards pragmatic solutions, as many of my publications do provide, but towards an opening of our minds to the dance between difference and similarity. I aim to talk about my scholarly journey towards understanding women at work. My talk is aimed at family and friends and the public at large. So I'm not going to relay many statistics or present a paper on a recent study. I won't explore concepts such as discrimination and social privilege and diversity management, nor will I attempt to address the intersectional nature of women as a grouping. But instead, I've decided to explore my journey of research towards deeper understanding of women at work. Thank you. For this lecture, I deliberately chose to focus on macro themes. I aim to spotlight an understanding about gender in the workplace, which you may intuitively recognize, but perhaps not yet have the language with which to advance your thinking. I also aim to invite both the social and the private back into the workplace. You see, my late father's mantra, "It's all a matter of balance," has shaped me further. As a scholar, I have now come to realize that my formative experiences have shaped how I look and work with research. And this is also a fundamental concept within feminist research. And also today's lecture is about balancing and finding a rhythm between difference and similarity towards just outcomes at work. So at the outset, I would like to clarify that throughout this lecture, I'll be referring to the term woman as individuals born and classified a woman, and then the lecture is heteronormative and utilizes gender in the binary, woman and man. So that's what I'll be focusing on. By acknowledging 50% of the South African and indeed the global population, that's a main focus, but there's also an exclusion criteria, and that's men. But one can never study women at work without having a contrast on men. The majority of employed workers globally who are regarded as economically active in both formal and informal employment are men. We also know that many women fall outside the employment net, but they are actually, in the true sense, economically active. They work to support those who are formally acknowledged as being economically active, even though they are not paid for that work. These women perform unpaid care work, which is often done by selflessly serving others. You might not have previously made the connection between feminist research and, for instance, the ability for men from generations younger than the baby boomer generation to show physical affection in public. The now more commonly accepted workplace practice of taking time off work to attend to family matters, and women having access to birth control. I thank Margaret Sanger from the USA and Marie Stopes from the UK, and the sponsorship from, amongst others, Catherine McCormick, a woman philanthropist who, together with a number of women and men technicians and scientists, developed human contraceptives, more specifically the birth control pill. Without the life experiences of these women and their passion for improving women's control over their own bodies, the development of this important pharmaceutical device would not have realized at a time in history when most scientific positions were held by men. Due to their own lived experiences, men just would not have considered this a primary priority. And it might have meant that we would not have reached this particular technology as it's been developed. And specifically, I want to highlight that if we did not have the birth control pill or other forms of contraceptives, we would not have seen women progressing in the workplace over the past 50 years as we have seen thus far. Over the past 10 years, we've seen women's labour force participation rates rise to levels near equal that of men in, for instance, the USA. We note the increase of professionally qualified South African women employed in companies that report to the Commission for Employment Equity. South African professionally qualified women overall, so I'm talking about the professionally qualified category, are now the only grouping equal to their economically active population grouping. And the majority of these women are Black African South Africans at 24.2%. But Black African women are not yet equal to their proportion of the economically active population. We also see more women than men graduate from higher education institutions. Yet, despite these heartening indicators, women remain underrepresented in a number of industries, in leadership roles and on boards, and women's remuneration on average also bear remains below that of men. So the statistics that I've mentioned point towards a need to mothball the pipeline argument. There are enough women in the pipeline. In a paper about research on women engineers, I outlined 50 years of research on women engineers, and that we've come full circle back again to the questions, many of the questions that we asked at the outset. Why are we still focusing on women at work? Let me start by coming back to my own lived experience. I never really bothered thinking of myself as a woman in a career. I thought of myself as an individual that was offering my time and talents in exchange for money. In fact, my parents encouraged us to take up post-school studies and pursue income-generating careers, and even become entrepreneurs, which I did try for a bit. Why would I then think of myself as different from my male colleagues? After reading the article by Gillian Ranson titled "No Longer One of the Boys," I experienced a watershed moment in my career. It created an understanding of a process that I was negotiating as a professional and a mother. Motherhood was central to my own self-concept and my own feelings of being what I would later term in publications unencumbered when referring to work before having a child. These thoughts were echoed by Ranson's explanation of the decision cycle that women professionals negotiate during their careers. There comes a point at which you realize you are not like the boys with whom you work, despite being professionally qualified, due to your ability to fall pregnant, or people assuming that you have the ability. A cynic would argue that many couples face family planning decisions together, and I don't dispute that. But there are also a great number of women who deal with the decision to have children without sharing it with anybody else. And some encounter pregnancy or infertility as a matter of biological fact. But no matter how decisions about family planning are reached, professional women have to take a number of conscious decisions about children in relation to their work that men need not consider. Women carry the baby, and an overwhelming number of women take the primary responsibility for the baby's day-to-day care, and especially in the early years of children's lives. This may not seem problematic to people. In fact, it's not negative at all. However, women's economic disempowerment creates a power imbalance. In our current market economy, adult individuals who are not able to generate their own meaningful income become vulnerable and exploitable. Since women are the primary carers of children, these children are also impacted by this power imbalance. Whilst we have moved beyond the incorrect assumption about differences around cognitive ability and so forth, there are differences that underpin us, and so feminist scholars contend as well. They bring about a number of implications for the inclusion of women at work. And so in my journey about understanding these differences, I followed a particular path, and I'm going to share a few of these theoretical lenses with you, and I promise hopefully not to bore too much around the theory. So identity work provides a useful lens for us to look at women at work. And here we ask the question, who am I? Who am I? We also know that work is central to the building of individual identity. However, for most women, questions of identity are elaborated on by the backdrop of loved ones and society, leading to questions such as, who will I be if I have a child? Who will I be if I don't have a child? And what does all of this mean for my career? Let me stop here and also just again give a balanced look at the topic. Most men also have concerns about their identity in relation to children, but very few have grave concerns about the impact of children on their jobs or career, other than the financial provisioning as an extension of their identity work. And often children in marital or romantic relationships dictate women's careers. This contention is illustrated by a study that I did with Varitza Wekwete and Rosalind de Bruin, which focused on Zimbabwean trailing spouses. These were all women that held decent paid employment, and their husbands were successful in being selected for jobs in other countries. The study documented the often emotionally painful process of women re-establishing their identities in the absence of paid work due to South Africa's restrictive visa scheme. The trailing spouse study also points to an obligation of care that organizations should provide to families, including the wives of expatriates, to ensure the mental well-being and stability of employees and families. Another theory, Super's individual level theory about life roles, was an area that I explored for quite some time. The theory posits the work role as in the realm of the economic private good, one that stands separate and sometimes in opposition to the family role. This then brings us back to women's inner conflict regarding combining a career and children. In a woman's life, her work role is inextricably conflated with her family role. The roles are not only interwoven, but success in the one is dependent on success in the other. In this way, the workplace enters the family life, and work is impacted also by family life. Based on our own lived experience of work and family, I have no doubt that many men will concur that their own lives bear testimony to this blurring of lines. This phenomenon is even more prevalent in family businesses and may even be considered central to the family business endeavor. But let's reflect on pre-industrial times during the agricultural revolution that is thought to have taken place about 12,000 years ago. Throughout the age of agriculture, work and family were one. This is then interesting to see that in modern organizational research, work-life balance has predominantly focused on women employees, and that policies to address this tug of war is labeled as, and I quote Amanda Goos, concessions for women. Arrangements that are made for work-family balance are regarded as concessions that employers make for women. It was during the Industrial Revolution, which began in England in 1760, that the split between family and work occurred, when social justice advocates lobbied for the removal of children from factories. This begs the question, who had to look after the children? The answer is evident that in the ensuing exodus of women from paid work in factories, since most women then did the work at home and men work in the factories, men took on the role of breadwinner and women that of caregiver. This has led to a change in family structure in childhood, and childhood before the Industrial Revolution was not the same as childhood thereafter. Previously, before the Industrial Revolution, children were seen purely as sources of labor, people to help you do what you need to do. So during the transition from peasant society to industrial wage labor society, the family underwent a qualitative change as a labor unit, from one that produced food to one whose primary function was to socialize and educate laborers for an industrial labor market that increasingly depended on a different type of labor. One must understand that the concept of childhood changed so radically that the cost to the family was not merely the money it paid for education. There was a big cost to the family in terms of a reduction in manual labor, and there was also a big cost to the women who were taken out of economic employment and the so-called workplace skills that went with it. The rest is workplace history. But it is clear that this arrangement continues to dictate the way in which we understand employment today. Economists in the audience will notice that there's utility value in both these roles, that the breadwinner and the caregiver has utility value in our current free market system. But free market theory is at a loss, particularly a political loss, to calculate the economic value that can be attributed to the caregiver role, since it falls outside the workplace. It falls in the private household, but more about that later. So life roles is another interesting lens to take up. And in a study on life role salience for dual career couples that I conducted with Busi Khaladi and Dion and Karina de Bruin, we found that Black South African women showed high levels of work role salience throughout their life stages, a finding contrary to prevailing career theory that emanates from the global north. In the global north, the work role for women is set to take on a secondary position during childbearing years. These assumptions are built on the career patterns of middle-class families where women often opt out of paid work to take care of children. But opting out of work is not an option for most South African women. Although some theories are appropriately borrowed from the West, we should not merely assume that all theories are applicable in less industrialized communal contexts. For instance, a reconfiguration of family accommodation in cities to incorporate larger and extended family structures may be part of the answers to South Africa's childcare needs, where, for instance, both parents can be present together with caregivers, and both mother and father can be breadwinners. Another way of understanding women's individual identity is to look at gender traits. Here, the work of Sandra Bem remains pivotal in describing gender traits, and she posited that there are three types of traits: masculinity, femininity, and androgyny. I did a study, actually numerous studies, together with a colleague, Madeleine Geldenhuys, and we investigated the differential item functioning of the BEM sex role inventory. Of interest is that typical feminine traits such as caring, compassion, and gentleness are increasingly cited as important traits for leaders in current-day workplaces. Other studies point towards masculine traits such as the willingness to take risks, independence, forcefulness, and dominance as best describing leaders. Madeleine and I did another study with students and found that although women were significantly more feminine than men, they also were more androgynous than men. Now remember, androgyny is where you score high between both femininity and masculinity. And so what we found is that women in the workplace are moving more and more towards androgyny, but men remain quite masculine in their stances. A critique of gender trait theory is that gender is not innate as traits are, and instead that the gendered behavior is enacted between people. The interaction is guided by social cues from us, around us, the cues that we pick up mostly from culture, and that human beings enact and display gender in socio-culturally appropriate manner in interaction with others. So in this way, masculine and feminine behaviors are displayed by people in relation to the interpretation of the needs of the people in the room. For example, how would my grade 1 teacher have reacted to the letter of protest about the unequal arrangement between the two classes on a Friday afternoon, coming from a little girl? When one considers what behavior is required for one to be regarded as a good leader, social influences should dictate that those women who agree to serve as leaders at work must be prepared to increasingly display androgynous or masculine behavior in order to meet the standard of a good leader. And none of us really want that. So a double bind develops. If you act in overtly feminine ways, you're likely to be disregarded as a leader. If you behave like men at work, you'll have consequences and you'll be regarded as aggressive and inauthentic, or perhaps even a queen bee. Circling back to the influence of women, children on women's work life, the explanation of gender traits and doing gender helps us to understand why women, even those that do not have children, may continue to feel excluded from especially senior leadership roles. We can therefore safely reject the view that women's lack of representation in senior levels in organizations is solely because they have or may have children in future. Despite the influence of very real responsibility of caregiving, gender traits and behavior in relation to gender norms, what is expected of a woman and man in society, may be a more useful lens for us to understand workplace outcomes for women. Human life is not the same as that of animals and insects. Humans create imaginary rules by which individuals, groups, and clans, and even nation states are governed. Indeed, the rules and norms that we find in the workplace are imagined social constructions. Can you believe it? They are. Often based on history or legacy, and always based on these imagined social rules of engagement that humans co-create. In this way, we come to understand ourselves in relation to others. So Joan Acker did seminal work on gendered organizations, and she also illustrated how jobs are embodied. Consider the following. An ideal worker is a disembodied worker. Ideal worker is a disembodied worker, one whose availability is uninterrupted, unencumbered by care obligations, and someone who never falls ill. Right? That's who we would want to have working around here. I'm sure, Ingrid. That would be great. Right. But since women's bodies can undergo periods of fragility, such as, for instance, after childbirth, and we can never be this ideal worker. Women thus represent a body that has the ability to, not necessarily does, but the ability to carry and birth a child. And their bodily strength is not always comparable to that of men, although there are many women whose bodily strength is. Women's bodies are therefore not regarded as an ideal norm for the workplace. While there is also the reality that men's bodies also don't meet those requirements. So employers are misguided if they believe that they are employing people who meet the requirements of an ideal worker, irrespective of whether they are employing women or men. Employers must therefore not create a false predicament when they believe that women are less suitable for work than men. Rounding off some of the theoretical insights about women at work, I was struck by a comment on one of the male students in a class that I presented here at this institution, and he said, "Women should take it or leave it. This is the way business works. We can't change it." Right, so how do you react to that? You swallow, and then you say, when one considers the gendered nature of organizations and jobs, I contend that businesses and business can change and will do so when we include more women without the expectation for them to behave like men or produce better outcomes than men. The typical business case argument comes to mind, which is often linked to an improved organizational performance or so-called business case that we want to make to employ women. And a lot of research focuses on that. In upholding balanced reporting on gendered organizational culture, Alison Palmer and I did a study on what transpired to be a female-dominated leadership team in a large corporate in South Africa, and we found that those women became gatekeepers for other women, and that organizational features were gendered towards the feminine. To maintain balance by averting men's fears of having the pendulum swing right to the other side and women dominating men, it's crucial to focus on ensuring diverse teams, with the aim of unlocking greater levels of inclusion at work and indeed societies. So, as a last lens on women at work, I would like to focus on the measurement of feminine contributions at work. And Leila, you and I spoke about this. I earlier stated that we struggle to calculate the economic value that can be attributed to the caregiver role and the value that is thought to be only to the private household. Let us think about the concept of care and behaving in a gentle and inclusive and collaborative manner. Feminine in nature, these are behaviors that are very useful in the workplace. Fletcher describes the provision of care at work as a disappearing act. It is often viewed as inappropriate and in conflict with imagery of masculine leadership. While organizations admit that they need to change, they do very little to effect it and to show that they value what women bring to the workplace. It is the work that many women do. Many men do this as well. But it is regarded as natural to women, that women are born with the ability to care well. I would argue that care is socialized and that women are taught to be gentle and caring. If we spend our lives honing caregiving as a skill from being born to where you get to the workplace, similar to honing maths as a skill from an early age, why are we not acknowledged and rewarded for the value of care in the workplace? It was during my search for answers on the gender pay gap that I came across the work of Catherine Markell, which highlights the fact that Adam Smith, the father of economic free market theory, had a blind spot: the unpaid care work of his mother. She kept his household for him. Free market economic theory is plagued by concerns about self-interest at the expense of selflessness, love, care, and support. Smith's blind spot. I would argue that the efforts of those who provide care and support to the young, sick, fragile, and in support of development of others at work are poorly compensated and recognized, if at all. And we find it extremely difficult to place an accurate economic value on care. As such, what is regarded as women's work in an organization, the feminine, is undervalued. Research on the feminization of occupations has also shown that women are selected into lower paying or average pay jobs, and that also once women enter into particular job categories, there is a devaluing of average pay. Just like the birth control pill, I laud the work of Joan Acker on comparable worth, which was undertaken in the USA during the 1980s and 90s with a reconfiguring of Oregon's job evaluation system. Acker did not succeed in changing the rules according to which job evaluation and salary structuring was done, but she was indeed instrumental in guiding us towards the present legislation on equal pay for jobs of equal value, of which men also benefit, because wage setting is political and not as neutral or objective as we would want to believe. Globally, we are in a historical period where we collectively becoming alive to the notion that work, family, society, and nature are all closely linked and interdependent. In the same way that societal gender dynamics are influenced by cultural norms and practices, workplace gender norms are influenced by society and also by the powerful imagined rules according to how we make our decisions. Looking towards the future, governing boards are already beset with ways to reduce the carbon footprint, transitioning to renewable products and recycling, and there goes the power. And intellectual, at the appropriate moment there, right? And intellectual activism has a vital and constructive role to play in shaping their thinking. Soon, we're certain to see organizational leaders finding ways of allocating value to the feminine, the act of caring, for Earth and all its resources, including people. And I say so because dealing with the planet, profit, and people will require more than ever collaboration, as solving large-scale problems requires outstanding teamwork. And now, I'm glad this is still on. By viewing work through the lens of women and feminism, political and business leaders will gain access to important and balanced, nuanced insights to everyone's advantage. Current assumptions will be challenged, which ultimately leads to the benefit of society at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bosch, for that very insightful and excellent inaugural lecture. Good evening to the Bosch family and friends, leadership of the Faculty of Economic and Management Studies, the Dean, Professor Ingrid Willard, to the Director of the Stellenbosch Business School, Professor Mark Smith, to the leadership of those faculties and to the business school colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to be with you this evening, to be part of and share in a rite of passage. This is a rite of passage in academia. The recognition of a colleague entering the ranks of a full professor, and them sharing through their inaugural lecture their innovative ideas, their discoveries, their deep insights, not just with the academic community, but with the public at large. Thank you, Professor Bosch, for the very personal story of your journey. And that theme of journey went throughout your inaugural lecture. About your development as an intellectual activist, and in particular on the lens of women at work and the value of the feminine acts of care and collaboration. You argued the need to find a balance between the feminine and the masculine to get a better understanding of gender in the workplace. You provided a number of theoretical lenses with which to understand these patterns of slow progress towards just outcomes for women at work. Now, one of the indicators of a really good inaugural lecture is the ability of the professor to share deep and complex disciplinary knowledge in a manner that is both understandable for the general audience, but also clearly articulates the novelty and the complexity of the work to disciplinary experts. Now, this is an incredible balancing act, and it also touches on your theme of balance within your lecture. And I have to say you've done that extremely well tonight. In your lecture tonight, you informed us that in the same way that societal gender dynamics are influenced by cultural norms and practices, so are workplace gender norms influenced by society. Through the powerful imagined rules, as you refer to them, according to which we make decisions and adjust our own behavior. You explain some of the origins of the imagined rules and conclude with the reasons why nuanced insights are to the advantage of both men and women, and ultimately business and society at large. The theme of journey and your journey to this particular point in your life and the influences of those close to you and yours and others' lived experiences came out loud and clear in terms of the philosophies that have been developed and that what you have presented tonight. Your lecture gives us certainty that soon organizational leaders will find ways of allocating value to the feminine, as you put it right towards the end, the act of caring for the earth and all its resources, including people. You emphasize that as long as feminine behaviors are not measured and allocated a fair economic value, we will be at a loss as to the incorporation of the societal and the private into solutions to the complex societal and climate problems that we face currently. By viewing work through the lens of women, political and business leaders will gain access to important, nuanced insight to everyone's advantage, and as you put it, ultimately to the benefit of society. Congratulations, Professor Bosch, on your incredible body of work and on your research, and the work that you undertake in the study of women at work, and understanding the complexity of workplace diversity, inclusion, and as you put it, ultimately belonging. Thank you for sharing your research on this fascinating topic. Your research is bringing incredible insights to advance society. Once again, congratulations on your work, and we look forward to the incredible impact that your work and your research will have in the years to come on society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Mark Smith. I'm the director of the Business School. I'm here to say a few thank yous. I think the most important person to thank is to thank Anita. Thank Professor Anita Bosch. She's shown us how gender research, doing gender, as she said, is so important. Gender is everywhere. You can't move, you can't understand society, you can't understand the way organizations work, families work, people's work, communities work, without understanding that. It's in the home, it's in the work, it's in society, it's our careers, our management, power relations inside the organization, the barriers that women face, and the barriers that men face if they find themselves in a feminized occupation. It really is everywhere. It also shows what I learned very early in my career was called the autonomy of supply side, how actually it's unstoppable. The rise of women's employment, the rise of women in the workplace is something we can't turn back. There are some politicians that would love to send women back to the household. Go back to those pre-industrial days that Anita talked about, when life was simpler. We could solve unemployment perhaps by getting rid of women from the workplace, but it just doesn't happen. Because women are themselves, in an autonomous manner, investing in their work, in their own careers, their own workplaces, their own development. Men would not support that either. They also benefit from that. We all benefit that in terms of society. So those individuals say, let's stop doing gender. Let's stop trying to fix these inequalities. They're in a hopeless position. Yet these inequalities persist. The inequalities that we see in education, in leadership, in employment, and Anita has really shown that to us. And unfortunately, what her work also shows is as one inequality opens, another one closes up. It's like one of those child games where things pop up and you have to whack them down. That's why we need people like Anita. We need pioneers to challenge the old inequalities, but also challenge the new inequalities that do keep popping up just as we close one. Pioneers that research the world of women at work and shine a light on the old patterns, the new patterns, and the trends as they emerge. And pioneers, really importantly, pioneers that can communicate with the rest of society and explain to business, to politicians, to community leaders why this is so important, why it's important to do gender, and why it's important that they understand the gendered implications of the way society works. Anita, Prof. Anita Bosch, does all of these things. So that's why we're proud to have her as a colleague. We're proud to have her as an academic leader. And we're proud to have her as a professor at Stellenbosch Business School. Thanks so much, Anita. Just as Anita thanked her family, she wouldn't be here today without their support, with a mother, a father, husband, children, all of her friends that have accompanied along the way. It wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be possible here tonight with many other people as well. So Anita's thanked everybody that's brought her here today in a touching and intimate way. But I extend my thanks to you as well, because thanks to your work, we as an institution, we as colleagues benefit from Anita's contribution. I'd also like to thank Prof. Ramjoganath from the DVC, representing the University of Stellenbosch, Prof. Woolard, representing the Economic and Management Sciences faculty, of which we're a part. Our colleagues in the business school have made this possible. The catering, which all of us in person will benefit from. I'm afraid you online will not benefit from. But I can promise you we will have fine South African wine and fine South African food. Come visit whenever you want. But also the other colleagues, Jonathan Blankenberg and his team that made this happen. The videoist, the technology that makes this place work, even when there's a power cut halfway through. And also to Rowena Pleikes, who makes many things happen in the background and keeps Anita on track, keeps us on track, and will keep many of our projects with the Women and Work chair going on track and going forward. So I thank all of you who've joined us this evening, particularly Anita's family and friends, but most of all I thank Anita. Thank you so much. Prof. Anita Bosch.